Well, almost every arena of life has a Hall of Fame, a version of a Hall of Fame, be it sports or technology or business. And, oh, wait a minute, let me back up here. We're going to read the text right up front because this is going to make more sense if I do. And I just wanted to mess with Ashley, so there we go. So, why don't you, let's stand and join together in our text. It's Acts 9, 36 through 43. Let's read together. Now in Joppa, there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At the time, she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Here we go. Peter put all of them outside, and then he knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. Okay, now we're back to the Hall of Fame. You may not know, but of all these other halls of fame, but there is a sewing Hall of Fame. There is. Now, unless you're a tailor or a dressmaker or a seamstress or a devoted sewing hobbyist, this may be trivial information, or at least mundane, but give me a second to put it in context, and I think you'll understand what we're talking about here. Now, the Sewing Hall of Fame was created in 2001, and this creation came about through the work of the American Sewing Guild, which was organized in 1970 as a response to sewing education being dropped from the education curriculum of most of our schools. And due to the fact that women were choosing to work outside of the home, which limited their time to sew, and their time to teach the craft to their children. Well, although the Sewing Hall of Fame's purpose was to strengthen the sewing industry and to stem the tide away from homemade clothing and crafts, its long-term legacy provided a far more meaningful societal impact, if you will. Here we go. You see, the inductees of the Sewing Hall of Fame are not only all recognized individuals who had a lasting impact on the sewing industry, but another more significant component of their reason for being inducted into the Hall of Fame was their legacy of service to human need through their craft. Here's 3 examples of this living legacy of compassion and care to the inductees, by the inductees into the Sewing Hall of Fame. Nancy Zimmerman, who was the first inductee, 2001, who wrote the book entitled Creative Kindness. And in that book, she detailed projects for sewer types, things like school uniforms for Haitian school children, berets for cancer victims, clothes for preemies, and garments for those experiencing hard times. She went on to also challenge and inspire her fellow sewers with these words: "I encourage you to make at least one thing for someone you will never meet." Pretty cool Hall of Fame, huh? Number 2. Martha Pullen, 2005 inductee, who in addition to being a world-class fashion innovator, was also an active member of her church and a volunteer on the Southern Baptist International Mission Board of Africa, or for Africa, Jamaica, and Brazil. And at her presentation at the Hall of Fame, she was described as a Proverbs 31 woman. Don't know what that is? Read Proverbs 31. Or just talk to my wife, Donna. How's that, honey? Yeah, okay. Then there's Joyce and Fred Drexler, the 2007 inductees. Fred is the only male in the Hall of Fame. Yes, guys, we made it. Now, they were owners of Speed Stitch and Sulky of America, custom embroidery companies, but their Hall of Fame legacy exceeds embroidery. You see, after Hurricane Andrew in 1992 devastated South Florida, Fred established Operation Mend, calling on the nation's sowers to share their stash. Now, you guys that aren't sowers may not know this, but sower people, they're little misers, man. They have material everywhere hidden in their house. I mean, under everything you can imagine. You don't believe me? Go into the Lydia room and just check that out. I mean, if there's a fire in this place, do not be in there. You're going to go fast if you are, because it's full of material. And so Fred says to all of his sewing friends across the country, all right, get into your stash and let's do something special with it. And what did they do? He called them to share their stash with these people in need, which brought about the filling of 2 semi-trailers loaded with sewing material, patterns, equipment, tools, and supplies that was delivered to Homestead, Florida, which was then distributed to people in need through the local American Sewing Guild chapters in that area. Pretty cool stuff for people who like to sew. Kind of puts some of the rest of us to shame that think we're pretty cool and can't figure out what it is we're supposed to be doing for the world around us. With all that in mind, I wonder if Tabitha would have been an American Sewing Guild Hall of Fame inductee if it had been around during the primitive church time in which she lived. Clearly, her legacy went far beyond her craft. So let's take a few minutes to explore her story and to glean from it the ways in which Christ's disciples are called to embody a life of devoted generosity in our world today. Now, Luke's story of Tabitha, or as the Greek is known as Dorcas, but I'm going to stick with the Hebrew name of Tabitha. By the way, her name meant gazelle, which was, in my estimation, one of the more beautiful animals with great skill and ability. Can't imagine how she got that name, but nonetheless. So I'm going to stick with Tabitha. But Luke's story of Tabitha holds a number of clues as for his purpose for including this story in his writings, because no one else talks about this. This is just kind of his thing. You see, the Gospel of Luke has 2 books, Luke and Acts. And in my estimation, no disrespect to all the other contributors to God's Word, but Luke is the only real writer in the bunch. He knows how to spin a story, and he knows how to keep you hanging from episode to episode. And really, as I shared during our Easter time, for Luke, the resurrection of Jesus was a high point, but it wasn't the culmination of God's mission. God's culmination of the mission was the transformation of the world through the gospel. And so the book of Luke, or our book of Acts, is Luke's way of saying, this is how that resurrection began to impact the world that we know today and make a difference in ways that are monumental. Now, the initial obvious purpose that Luke had was to proclaim, and using Lydia, or using Tabitha to proclaim her devotion to the gospel, was to really set aside this first stage of growth and expansion of the kingdom. Because the interesting piece in this text is that Tabitha is called a disciple, and this is the only place in the New Testament where the feminine version of the word disciple is ever used. Not with Mary, not with Martha, not with anybody. Tabitha is a female disciple. Luke is saying, can you see it, folks? Can you see what's happening? How God's emerging kingdom is ever expanding, ever including, ever changing. Now, the uniqueness of her title as a disciple, as well as her legacy of good works and acts of charity, suggests that she was, in fact, a significant member of that faith community in Joppa. And I think this reality prompted the community to fetch Peter from Lydda in hopes that God might use him to change her situation, to reclaim her life. So upon arrival, Peter is taken to the upper room in which Tabitha is placed. Interesting little piece in this story. Generally, when a body is deceased and is to be presented to the community to be mourned and to the family to be cared for, it is done in the bottom floor of the house. The upper floor is the private area. Why is Tabitha upstairs? Well, there's a reason, I think, because I think the community of faith wasn't ready to let go of her. They were having Peter come to the upper room. Now, where have I heard upper room before in the New Testament? What's happened in upper rooms before? So anyway, upon arrival, he goes to the upper room where she is, and this is when the widows display their clothes and tunics. And it's important to understand that by Luke using the term widows, he's saying to all of us and to those in his audience that God's message of grace goes to the very least of these. Because widows were the ones pushed to the side. If they didn't have family to care for them, they were toast. They were set aside, they became marginalized, they were abused, and oftentimes their lives were at best horrible. But something about this community of faith, that wasn't the case, because there was a number of those widows involved in that community and connected to Tabitha. I wonder what that's saying to us. Is Tabitha just somebody with great skill and a seamstress? Or does she recognize that her mission in life was not just to cover and clothe people, but to give them value, purpose, meaning? Let them know that they are loved in God's eyes. Because in that culture, in that time, and in that day, they were not. Plain and simple. They were just stuff to deal with. Not children of God, to be cherished and cared for and valued. Well, although the resurrection piece of the story is significant, I think there is a deeper message here. You see, Tabitha's life of tangible compassion, I believe, is used by Luke to demonstrate the very nature of God's emerging kingdom in at least two ways. First, its inclusiveness. Remember, she's the first disciple whose the feminine term is used to acknowledge her presence, her life, and her ministry. So God's kingdom is doing different stuff than it was before. Just prior to this, it was all about the guys. And it's just after this, there's a whole other story that's even better. Secondly, this emerging kingdom must place a priority on extending generosity to those on the margins. This is not a relationship with God for just all of us who are in the loop, but rather how can we open our lives, our resources, our talents, and our abilities to be used by God to value others, to help them discover their ultimate identity as a child of God, not what society says they are, but who God created them to be. Lastly, I want you to notice Luke's subtle way of placing Tabitha's story in the flow of God's ever-emerging or ever-expanding reign throughout the Roman Empire. You see, Peter is now in Joppa, staying in the house of a certain tanner called Simon. Now, for those of you who are Bible scholars, you're ready to chomp at the bit, because chapter 10 of Acts is one of the pivotal chapters of Luke's work. Because in Simon's house, Peter is upstairs one day, relaxing in the afternoon, and a little bit hungry, and he has a vision. God lowers this big tarp full of all the animals of the kingdom, and some of them are unclean. And God's voice says to Peter, "Eat and be filled." And Peter, as Peter would do from time to time, told God where to stick it. Just basically said, "God, I'm not going to do that. These things are unclean." And of course, what always happened when Peter did that, God would come back and say, "Okay, doofus." That's in the Greek. It doesn't get translated, but it's in the Greek. Why are you calling unclean what I have made clean? Immediately, he gets a sounding from down below that a centurion by the name of Cornelius has sent some people to come and have him come and visit them and tell them about this Jesus that he's heard about and what's going on. And in Acts chapter 10, the gospel explodes from a Jewish sect to an international community of faith. I think it's interesting that Peter uses uses Tabitha as a means of setting this up, a means of being able to help us understand that there's no small players in God's kingdom. One of my favorite tunes. But, yeah. Yeah. But what is the meaning of Tabitha's story for Salem First Presbyterian Church in this Commitment Sunday? In a year when we lost a couple of our own Tabithas, along with a number of Salem First Presbyterian Church saints. To what expression of a devoted life of generosity is the Spirit calling you and me as disciples of Christ as we gather here today? Well, Tabitha's life of devoted generosity calls us to embrace a holistic stewardship, in my estimation, that encompasses our time, our talent, and our treasure, and that places a priority on those on the margins. Tabitha's quiet devotion to God's emerging reign in her corner of the world reminds us that we all have a part to play in Christ's mission in our corner of the world. Her role as the New Testament's recognized feminine disciple reminds us of God's inclusive call to all of God's children, which means ain't nobody left off the team anymore, folks. The only way you get off the team is to go to the church triumphant. Otherwise, you got a job to do, a role to play, a part to contribute to. Now, Tabitha's willingness to engage not only her resources, but her entire life to lift those whose society had forgotten, calls us, in my estimation, to a holistic stewardship that lifts those on the margins, not only by extending care, but here's the important piece that I think the widows gathered around Peter displayed, but by granting value, imparting value, humanity to those we care for. 10 years ago, as we began our sacred journey to become a missional community of faith, I assured you that we would see a day when the annual facility costs of our campus would be covered by the income produced by our campus as we partnered with human service agencies and ministries in the heart of our city. Well, based on the amazing commitment of your session, the diligent efforts of your administration committee, your ministry staff, and our ministry partners throughout our city, this will be the first year we project an annual facility maintenance cost that will be covered completely and solely by the income coming from this facility. What does that mean? That means that not one single dollar of your estimate of giving will go to this facility's maintenance, but rather go directly to the mission and ministry we are called to fulfill in this city in the ways that we have done over the past 10 years and ways we can't even imagine as we move to the future. Now, for me, that's pretty phenomenal stuff. It's been a long ride. There have been many times when people have come to me and said, well, that's just never going to happen. And if you know anything about me, telling me something's never going to happen just is not the smart thing to do. But now, let me be clear. The maintenance of this facility, there's a lot of deferred maintenance. I mean, this building's over 70, 80 years old, something like that. 24, I think, or something when it was first built, or 29. There's deferred maintenance on anything that old. I mean, there's deferred maintenance on me as old as I am. So, we got to take care of that sort of stuff. And so we're going to be looking into ways of doing that. A part of the way we're going to let you know how we plan to do that is in our phase 1 of the New Matrix Vision Action Plan that we approved at session Tuesday night. And we will pass out to you on next Sunday, so you'll be able to pick one up after worship at either service. And then we will invite you to join us on June 30th at 1:30 right here for a discussion about that plan, what it means and what it entails. Some of it has to do with enhancing the ability for this facility to cover its own needs, not just annual maintenance, but all deferred costs as well. And there's some exciting things in the making. There's some challenges before us and all of that sort of stuff. But the key thing is we want to let you know that there's some other things we're going to be doing in this next year that I believe is going to enhance the life and ministry of this church. It's going to be a stretch. It's going to be a challenge. I can tell you right now there's going to be some things that we're going to be proposing that you, if I were to tell you now, you would all go, so I'm not telling you now. But we will talk about it in June, and I want you to trust me. I want you to trust me. I asked you to trust me 10 years ago. I want you to trust me now. Because I believe God's got some great things in store for us. And we've got the track record to prove it. Okay. Tabitha's story also reminds us that a life of devoted generosity is a life aligned with Christ's emerging mission in the world. A mission of human flourishing, of lifting those in the margins, of imparting value to all of God's children. See, Luke's choice to use Tabitha's story as the setup for Peter's call to bring the gospel to the Gentiles through his visit with Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 reminds us of the interlocking nature of God's reign in our world. There's no missed opportunities. There's no dropped balls. There's no small player. This means there are no small players. There's no parts too small in God's drama of redeeming love. Rather, God uses every act of devoted generosity to touch and change lives, to redirect human trajectories, and to alter long assumed outcomes with empowering hope. Tabitha's story in coming on before Cornelius' story and that great breakthrough says to us, it's every little action that makes the difference. Too often we're waiting for the big splash that we can be a part of so we can put it on our Facebook page. And our 4 friends can go, cool. What would happen if we actually started looking at the ways God can invite us to care for those around us, bringing value to people in the process of doing it? Friday evening, I had the great privilege of being a part of Salem Leadership Foundation's Fancy Friday dessert. Part of our church had sponsored 2 tables, one at the lunch and one at the dessert in the evening. I've been attending that, I think, almost every year since I've been here. And I have to say, my first couple of times attending, I was so impressed with the stories that Salem Leadership Foundation would lift up of people of goodwill and people of faith coming together and creating this powerful, dynamic city of shalom in Salem. And the stories were tear-jerking and emotional and inspiring and all that kind of stuff. And every time I would, it came time for the video, I always took my glasses off because it's like, okay, I'm going to lose it anyway. Well, I remember early on when I started listening to those stories and being moved by that, I can remember deeply in my heart saying, Lord, how can we do that? How can we be a part of this journey in the city of Salem? How can Salem First Presbyterian Church be a player in this? Because at that time, we simply weren't. It took us a while to even get our banner up on the wall. And it isn't that, it was just, I don't know why. And, but it was interesting because, we had those years where it was kind of like everybody else in town was doing great stuff. And we knew we were doing it as well, but somehow we just weren't connecting in ways that were important. We weren't part of the hands coming together. Well, on Friday evening, all that changed. In fact, Luann has a hard time with me saying this, but I was embarrassed because out of the 4 major thrusts of the Salem Leadership Foundation over the past year, we were key players in 3 of them. They wouldn't have happened without us. And to be able to just be there and kind of bask in, not in a pride that look what we did, but just thank you, Lord. Thank you for hearing my prayer. A prayer I couldn't even articulate, I just longed for. That someday, before I'm gone, that I could share with this church this kind of experience. It had to do with ministry to students at risk through Brothers of Valor, which is housed right down the hallway, a state-of-the-art studio that we have here. And if you've ever been here on in the evenings, you'd be surprised the number of interesting people looking around here. Not only that, we have working with Ikebox to try to bring that ministry across the street and place it on our property and partner with them on how to continue that. And no doubt that's a major thing. Refugee resettlement was another major thing that we were a part of, and one of the early players that helped get Salem, Salem Refugees or Salem for Refugees established. And what was the third one? There was a third one. I'm trying to, Warming Center. Duh. Yeah. Yeah, there was a church that had people in their basement. Oh, that was us. That prior years, it just was kind of floundering. But when we stepped up and said, you know what, we'll be one of it. There'll be 2 other churches joining us on the south side, on the east side, and the rest is history. I got to tell you, when I left that night, I was feeling pretty proud of Rob and our impact team for all the stuff they've done and what's come about. The history of this church is that in decades gone by, legislation was influenced, formed, and shaped in this room with classes of 200 people talking and taking seminars about different things going on that were going to be happening in the Capitol. We had a major impact on how that all played out. 4 governors, a president of the United States, out of this little church, out of Salem. The legacy is pretty phenomenal. And I got to say that there's been times I think, wow, we're in the shadow of some giants, folks. But not after Friday night. Nah. Now the world's changed. Our church has changed. The needs of our community has changed. But the mission of Christ goes on, and on. And God is using us in the process. In a couple of weeks, we will celebrate Salem First Presbyterian Church's 150th anniversary. 150 years of life and mission that spanned a huge portion of Oregon's history. The state of Oregon is only 10 years older than we are. And while it is good to remember our past with pride, today you are invited to pick up the mantle. You are invited to add your name to the legacy of generosity, knowing with confidence that your estimate of giving will be invested in our ongoing mission of human flourishing, of lifting those in the margins, and of valuing all of God's children that come our way, not on maintaining this building or mowing the yard on this campus, but on touching lives. And all of God's people said, Amen.